Hello there, welcome back to Philosophyinsights. Today I wanted to put your attention on an interview with Loise Perry on feminism. First of all, I want to thank Chris Williamson for giving Philosophyinsights the permission to share this clip. So, Loise Perry is the press officer of the campaign called We Can't Consent to This. She calls herself a feminist, but she thinks that the sexual revolution was a disaster for women. She pointed out that one of the big problems was the ignorance for basic biological facts or merely differences between men and women. This is the clip I'm talking about.
So my argument in the book is basically that there are some really important ways in which men and women are different from one another. So some of those differences are physical and should be fairly obvious. Like only women can get pregnant, men are bigger and stronger than women are on average, but also that the difference is massive between the means. And also there are psychological differences, which a lot of feminism of the last half century or more has been really invested in minimizing, but are, I think, definitely there if you look at the research. And if also you just look at the world around you. One of those differences, for instance, is that male sexuality is different from female sexuality on average, that men are more likely to be into things like casual sex, watching porn, buying sex, all things that have become much more socially acceptable post-sexual revolution. And my argument basically is that the sexual revolution was kicked off by the pill, and which did a pretty good job of severing the link between sex and reproduction, and kind of gave the impression that sex could just be a leisure activity, that it didn't have to mean anything, it could just be sort of a bit of fun. And my argument is actually that idea that sex is just a bit of fun, it doesn't really mean anything, suits male interests much more than it does female, because casual sex in particular is just one, men want it more than women do, and two, women carry all of the risks associated with it, like physical risks like pregnancy and violence and so on. So my argument basically is it's a bad deal for women.
Originally it was the sort of thing that was pushed by liberals and feminists, right? This is exactly the sort of thing.
Still, yeah. I mean, so the popular narrative that I'm challenging is one that the sexual revolution was like a feminist accomplishment. And I don't think that's true. I mean, which is not to say that there aren't some things about it that have been good for women. I mean, if you look at the story of recent decades in particular, there are all sorts of ways in which women are doing great, actually. Like women are going to university more often than men are. They are, right up until they have children, are doing better in the workplace. You know, it's not to say that like everything is like the battle of the sexes, women are like losing across the board, not at all. But I think in terms of sexual culture, that I'm concerned. I'm concerned for women. I'm also concerned for men. I mean, there's a lot in the book about, for instance, the really malign influence of porn on young men. Like in a superficial and short-term way, it's great to be a really attractive man in this sexual culture, right? You can basically attract as many partners as you like. You know, consequence-free sex is freely available to you. But I think actually in the long run, that's not a happy way to live your life.
You say that your complaint is focused more against liberals than conservatives. Why is that?
I mean, because I'm expecting liberals to read it. I might be wrong about that, but that's the space that I'm coming from originally. Like I went to such a left-wing university.
Where did you go?
I went to SOAS in London.
I don't even know what that is.
It's like a really, really small, really crazy university. I've read all of this radical stuff as a student, and I'm coming from a feminist background and coming from, as I said, the New Statesman that I work for is historically left wing. So I'm trying to speak to those people. But I mean, the book's for conservatives as well, because there are bits in it that I think everyone will find challenging.
Is it not the fact that a lot of what you're talking about here is conserving some fairly traditional views around men's and women's roles with each other, about sort of chivalrous conduct and having constraints on the way that men and their aggression and their desire for multiple sexual partners, like that that is a fundamentally conservative value. So it seems to me like the conservatives would have far less to disagree with you on. Not, again, there's something for everybody to disagree with, but that the conservatives would probably have far less than the new wave of liberals.
Probably, yeah. Although I should say that this idea of like constraining male sexuality, which is central to my thesis, basically, it is conservative in the sense that it was considered to be like a mainstream idea before sexual revolution in the West. But if you look across time and place, like that's not necessarily considered like a trad thing to do. I mean, like if you look, for instance, at antiquity, the idea that some high status man would have sexual access to his underlings was like completely accepted. It's really, I don't know if you've read Tom Holland's book Dominion.
No, you don't mean Tom Holland, the guy that plays Spider-Man, do you?
No, I don't. a common mistake. No, no, he's a British academic and historian writer, and he's got this fantastic book called Dominion, which is about basically about history of Christianity and the ways in which Christianity influences the modern world, even if we consider ourselves to be a-religious or post-Christian. And he has a bit in there where he talks about Me Too. And it really triggered a lot of my thinking about this, actually. It was a few years ago, where he points out that in, say, the Roman world, no one would think that Harvey Weinstein was doing anything wrong. Like the idea that this guy who's at the top of the tree of his particular hierarchy would be able to have sexual access to anyone kind of subordinate to him was like, yeah, obviously. And actually the idea that he should be constrained is, Holland argues, a very Christian idea. And I'm not Christian. I'm not coming at this from a religious perspective. But it's worth pointing that out. Like this is not necessarily a normal thing to think.
Well, the window of trad sort of shifts over time, right? Like no one's actually going that far back. So the sexual revolution happens. Like surely women have benefited with no more shame and stigma around enjoying sex and stuff like that. Like who benefited from the sexual revolution overall?
Yeah, so the shame and stigma thing. I mean, yes, that is definitely one outcome. I mean, like I think that one of the things that I'm trying to push in this book, and that is I shared with like Mary Harrington and Nina Powell that you've had on the show before. We're on the same page about this, like challenging the idea of progress. Particularly from a feminist perspective, this idea that history has a shape and everything is always getting better and better, and that the sexual revolution, everything post-sexual revolution is necessarily better than what came before. I just don't think is true. I think that's nonsense. Like we're looking at a massive historical event triggered primarily by technology. Of course, there are going to be upsides and downsides. So I think it is absolutely the case that women now can be much more open about sexuality and are more able to enjoy sex in certain circumstances and stuff. That's true. But I also think that to some extent, like we're social animals and we're very responsive to norms. And what I think has happened is kind of the norms have just spun on a sixpence. And now, whereas previously it would have been the case that young women, for instance, were like protecting their virginity and their reputation for being chaste and so on was considered very important socially. Now, if anything, it's the opposite, or not quite the opposite, but that now the pressure actually is on for women to be up for it and to be just as like sexually adventurous as the guys. And, like it's like a slightly painful, there's a contradiction within that, which is really hard to navigate for young women. Where on the one hand, like it's good to be sexually open, it's good to sort of base your reputation on being really sexy, but also there is actually a penalty if your body count is too high, which is quite difficult. And I think a lot of young women don't necessarily realize that as well. Like they're actually treading a really difficult tightrope. Which is why I think this idea of like, oh well, people can do whatever they want now, like, we're all free to behave as we want sexually, I just don't think is true, because every culture has expectations in relation to sex, has norms in relation to sex. I think that what we've done though is that we had some quite deeply embedded norms which were thrown out the window as a consequence of sexual revolution, and now there's like a sort of halting effort to maybe rebuild them. Sometimes they're implicit, and it's kind of the Wild West out there, basically. And
who's enforcing this then? Where's this coming from? Are you suggesting that men are weaponizing women to believe that they should have a particular type of sexual proclivity that then plays into men's hands because they get more variety?
I don't think there's a conspiracy. I don't think that anyone is enforcing it. I think that it's just everyone like responding to incentives as individuals, and that knits together to create the culture that we see before us. So, like, yeah, it is in the interests of men who want to sleep around to encourage women to match them, you know, in that kind of behavior. So that's clearly going on at an individual level. But then in terms of like women's magazines encouraging their readers to do the same, I have some, I did a lot of digging through women's magazines for this book, and like there are some really grim articles out there.
What were your least favorite headlines?
I can't remember exactly the wording of it, but there's a whole genre of articles in women's media about encouraging women not to catch feelings. Or, I mean, the way that it's phrased is how anyone of any gender cannot catch feelings when they're having casual sex, and how to have casual sex in like a fun feminist way, etc., etc. But like, we know that women are much more likely to bond quickly with their sexual partners. We know that they're just much less likely to like casual sex. Something that's a really interesting and really marked difference between men and women on average in sexuality is women's sexual disgust threshold is a lot lower. So women will get the ick much easier than men will. But if you're going to participate, if you're going to have sex like a man, you have to overcome all of those instincts, right? And so there's this whole genre of women's mags that will basically like instruct their young readers in how to suppress their instincts and have sex that actually they kind of know deep down they shouldn't be having, which I think is really bleak.